So let's start off with our next learning outcome, and it's just about pressing record. So give me 1 second, and that should be okay. So we are going to discuss learning outcome 4 today. Just going to mention this very briefly. I've got a bad throat, so sometimes if I need to take a quick break, I'll take a break just to have a glass of water. I've got tickly cough. So without further ado, let's start off with learning outcome 4 today, which is where we are looking at understanding the structures which are designed to support people within organization. So here what we are looking at is understanding the role of HR, the HR department's roles, look at some of the policies and procedures which HR puts in place, and then also look at some of the practices which sometimes when we do see HR putting in place, and how these practices essentially can be used to support people specifically related to the HR side of things. For example, performance appraisal, looking at resource allocation, looking at reviews, training, and some of the other policies which sometimes people look at when we look at the functions of HR. Things like grievances, appraisals towards the end of the year, and in terms of job descriptions is what we are going to be looking at in this particular learning outcome. Now, this learning outcome will also focus on, having, for example, a couple of things which are related to, some parts of the indicative content which is given in the towards the back of the document, which is in the unit specification. And this tends to be looking at some of the key breakup of, role of HR, human resource department in particular. We'll also be looking at understanding, say, for example, policies and procedures and what these policies and procedures could be. We'll look at a few in a bit of detail just to understand, how they can be used and how they are practically used within the organization when we talk about, the aspect of the policies, and specifically with relation to HR policies. Obviously there are lots of policies, but what we want to be able to do is basically understand HR policies in particular, and that is what we will be looking at focusing on. And then what we'll also do at some stage would be to try and understand certain practices which HR sometimes looks at putting into place, and these practices that HR puts into place tend to be related to coaching, mentoring, training, performance appraisals, and obviously looking at performance reviews. So when we do talk about them, there are a lot of them that we look at in particular when we talk about the different types of practices which the HR essentially looks at. And when we look at appraisals, we talk about 360-degree appraisal, balanced scorecard. We look at management by objectives. We also look at, just the normal appraisal, which happens with your departmental manager. And those are the kind of bits that we'll be looking into, going into, brief detail, trying to understand, what it is and how this is related to the HR side of things. So as always, I've got a presentation which I've refreshed, and what I would want to do is essentially take you through that refreshed presentation to cover the indicative content. And as we go along, we can have discussions on some of the bits that we, will cover today in Learning Outcome 4. So if I switch you over now to the presentation slide, and then we will crack on with our discussion. So this learning outcome focuses on understanding 3 parts. What is HR department? So we look at the structure, we look at policies and procedures, how they support people within the organization, and then what could be the various practices which HR puts into place in a particular workplace. That means an organization, essentially a business or a company. Now, these are the 3 parts to the indicative content, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail. So let's look at delving into some key terminology first. Now, how do we define, when you say define HRM, there is a definition of HRM. And when we talk about HRD, so what is HRD? There is a difference, subtle difference between the two. So when we talk about HRM and then we talk about HRD, there is a subtle difference between both of them. Can you think of what are the differences between the two? Any idea?
Yeah. I beg your pardon. What question have you asked, please?
So the question is, we want to look at what is HRM and what is HRD. What is the difference between the two? These terms are used interchangeably from time to time. What we want to do is understand what is HRM and what is HRD. Any ideas, any initial or simple thoughts? Okay.
Unfortunately, I think I don't have an idea of what it is.
No worries. And Maria,
Maybe
any
if you
idea?
could explain for me.
Yes, Maria, any ideas at your end?
Yeah.
Any thought process
I
at your
can't.
end?
I can't hear it.
So what I would suggest is, just as a brief bit, if you're not asking anything, please keep your microphones muted so that the background noise could be minimized. Okay, I've got you texting back to me saying that that's fine, no problem. So when we look at essentially the aspect of HRM and HRD, there is a very subtle difference when we use the term human resources management. And if I just say, what is the difference between, so let's look at this just as an example, HRM and HRD. Now, human resources management. And on this side, when we talk about human resources management, what we are essentially saying is that when we look at managing the current workforce, that means somebody who's employed, somebody, and focusing on the present, then is where we will be basically referring to what is called HRM. When we talk about HRD, it is human resource development. So in this case, what tends to be the focus is when we are looking at developing the future or developing the workforce, let's put it this way. And what we are looking at is, here we are talking about the future. So when we talk about human resources management, we are talking about the function which is looking after the current people who are enrolled and they are employed within the organization, have a contract, and they are being supported by you as an HR manager or as a person within the HR to essentially help them do their roles and responsibilities. When we talk about HRD, we talk about development of, so the key word here is management versus development. Here you manage, and here you're looking at developing the workforce for future requirements of the company. For example, if the company is looking at deploying a software, then the HRD side of the function, which is training and development, would be coming into swing. And somebody who looks after training and development will actually start training the employees towards handling the new software so that they are able to become more effective and more productive. And this will be looking at understanding how they could position, train, and then equip the employees essentially to be able to work effectively in the future. And that is why the difference of HRM and HRD. Now, when we look at a particular organization, you would generally see that HR functions tend to be quite a lot. That means there are lots of things depending on the size and scale of the organization. We would generally see that if there is a company which has 200 employees, 2,000 employees, you will have the size of the department taking care of different types of functions. So if it was a sole trader, something like a small business, like a news agent or somebody wherein you have 3 or 4 employees, then in that case, you would generally see the HR function would be predominantly carried out by the director of the company. The function would involve maybe giving a contract, maybe looking at an annual appraisal at the end of the year and deciding on doing reviews and maybe deciding on the bonus. But if the company has 200 employees or large number of employees, the director of the company or the key management will not be able to do all these functions, and they will need to look into other aspects of the HR as well. So that is where they would need to look at recruitment, selection, training and development, performance management, career success planning. That means If I've been working in my role for 5 years and I'm due for a promotion, then annual appraisals year on year and the roles that are performed would be then looked at, and I would be then trained to take up a senior position in the organization. That is called career progression or career planning. Compensation and benefits. Every year, if the company is doing well, you're meeting your targets, and assuming the company also wants to maintain competitive rates along with what the competition is paying its employees. If you compete with other companies in the sector, then you would need to look at compensation and benefits, rewards and recognition. If you are a performer, if you do well, you get rewards in the organization. That could be incentives, it could be bonus, it could be share options, lots of different things depending on the size and scale of the organization. If it's a big company, again, policies and procedures would need to be looked at. Policy and procedure in a simple organization tends to be an employee handbook, but in bigger organization, it tends to be protocols or processes that employees are expected to follow if they face a problem or hurdle, or if they are given a particular situation and it comes to creates an issue, then there are policies and procedures which are written to manage those issues. You have employee engagement programs, you have health and safety, you have disciplinary action, you have compliance with labor laws and legislation in the country if the company has international operations. So these are all the different kinds of functions the HR will perform. Now, some of these functions will be HRM, which is management, and some of these functions will be development, because the company is looking at developing its workforce. The company is looking at growing. It's growing year on year. Revenues is growing. Profitability is growing. The company is investing in its resources. That could mean they would bring in more training and development, reskills. They would be looking at introduction of employee benefits. Rewards and incentives would be, increasing or making them better. And these are kind of things which you would classify with the human resources department within an organization. Now,
excuse me, sorry to interrupt.
Go on.
Kindly give me the different functions under HRM and HRD. I think I'm a little bit confused somewhere. Just like two or three examples under each, under HRM and under HRD.
So what you need to do is, Vanessa, maybe pay a bit more attention and go through the lectures at a later stage. I'll answer your question very briefly. If you recall, HRD is future related. So if I look at this particular chart, you should be able to understand that career planning, succession planning, compensation and benefits, training and development could be HRD. That means developmental functions, because the company cannot say that I have got the highest salary. Salary levels will need to be revised if the inflation increases. People will always want promotion in the company, but they will need to base it on certain previous requirements. That means previous performance. So it will not be difficult for you to pick out yourself that what are the functions which are going to be classed under development. Things like policy formation. Now, this is a policy formation. Nowadays, companies are adapting to digital policy, social media policy. Now, these are developmental functions, because 20 years back, there was no social media. 20 years back, there was internet was available, but only available for emails. But today, there are laws and legislations and policies and procedures which companies have, and they are still developing, because they are new things which companies are getting to grips with. So these are examples of development. When you look at ongoing functions and management, things like employee engagement, health and safety, anything to do with compliance with regulation, like in the UK, you have a minimum wage act. So if every year, if the minimum wage changes, one of the things which the HRM would do is adjust the salaries of employees which are working on minimum wage to what has been set by the government. Recruitment selection, if you look at hiring new people in the company, recruitment and selection would tend to be, management side of things. So there are ongoing functions, and there are functions that a company's department would carry out, keeping in mind long-term future, and that is how you would differentiate HRM versus HRD. Now, the second thing, sorry, I hope that answers your question. Now, the second thing that we want to look at in the learning outcome is it talks about policies and procedures. What is a policy? And when do we have a policy, or what is the reason why we have a policy? So policy is an outline of the process which has been detailed out by the organization. Now, one such example I'll give you is that when you look at us as a college, UK Versity, we have a recruitment policy. So if there is one person who manages admission, tomorrow, as we are expanding, we have 2 admissions manager now in the organization. So both the admission managers need to have a common outlook in terms of how we are going to recruit people into students into the organization. So the recruitment policy is written as a standard procedure or as a policy for them to follow, and it will tell them what are the do's and what are the don'ts, and if you get stuck, this is the place you go to the manager. The procedure tends to be the detailing of the policy, what is to be done. So for example, having said I have a recruitment policy means we look at people which have minimum level of English, we look at their eligibility towards the course, we look at their age, and we look at obviously their progression ability to be able to study a course. Now that is what the recruitment policy helps us look at. So we cannot take on anybody who is less than the age of 16 because they're not, they're not eligible enough to study a course, and that would be the policy. Now, the procedure will go into details. So when I say somebody wants to join a level 4 course, we will look at the procedure to see their eligibility, and that eligibility will come because we'll go into details of your prior qualification, what is your interest, where do you want to progress to in the future, and what would be the outcome of studying this course from a point of view of adding skills and knowledge to your overall professional qualification. And that will be a procedure. Procedure will also mean that once you are enrolled as a student, we take you through an induction process. We also make you aware of the fees that you need to pay, the requirements of the course, and that would be detailed out in the procedure. So when we talk about policies and procedures, policies tend to be outlines or guidelines which everybody is expected to adhere to. But when we have a problem or when we want to go into detail, then we look at a procedure. Another example that I'll give you is in most offices and organizations, we have a health and safety policy. Now, why is the policy there? Your premises is insured, the company has an employee liability insurance, but in the eventuality if somebody is to have an accident or there's an accident which occurs in the office, there is a policy which has been listed and it's put into implementation to note that incident. The first thing that the policy would predict and ask you to do is that in an incident logbook, please log the incident which has happened. Then if the patient or the person needs treatment, then the treatment needs to be given through the first aid box, or there should be somebody who should be a trained first aider who's able to take care of the person who's got injured till the time medics actually arrive. Now, all this is written in the health and safety policy, but the procedure details out why do we need to record this as an incident. We need to then look at doing a action plan to mitigate this incident in the future. We need to ensure that everybody knows who is what is their requested action to take. Now, if somebody gets injured because they've had a slip or a fall within the office, the floor was wet and the wet floor sign wasn't displayed, the person has had a fall and has hurt his back, then the person in the organization who is aware, is a health and safety expert or a first aider, will be the first person to come and help the person who has had this fall. Now, these steps which have to be taken are detailed out in the policy procedure, not in the policy, the procedure of the policy, which is to be followed to follow a series of steps so that everything which has been documented has been taken as per the action presented in the policy. Now, HR policies and processes would be essentially the details of descriptions of what the employees are expected to do in the organization. They would include things like your code of conduct, your time management, what data you can share, what policies, or say, for example, what information you can share outside, how do you write an email, what is the protocol that you follow if this problem is to happen. All these are written in the HR policies and processes. Now, sometimes in organizations, these are a part and parcel of what is called the employee handbook. And the employee handbook will have things like process on applying for maternity leave, process for applying on an annual leave, process if you want to apply for a loan, or there would be an appraisal process which has been documented that at the end of the year you'll have appraisals. And all these things are documented, clearly provided to the employees by the HR department in transparency, so that when the time arises and the need arises, then these can be used to essentially, let's say, get a job done, or for example, get an appraisal done, or to example, sort a problem. And that is why these policies and procedures would be there. Now, example of this would be, when we talk about example of policies and procedure, would be how to apply for maternity leave, or if I'm a father, basically paternity leave, right? If you have a grievance, that means you have a grievance against an employee, then how would you apply, and make a complaint against a particular employee or, your boss. So these are policies and procedures which will be given in the HR. Compensation, say for example, your contract will be all documented, how a contract will be given, when do you become permanent, till what time are you on a trial period, how can the company fire you if you're not working or meeting the targets. All this will be explained in the HR policies and procedures. Last but not the least, what I want to address is, in the learning outcome, there is something, as I mentioned, about practices. Now, HR has lots of practices. That means HR is a function which primarily requires you to, put things into action. So when we talk about HR practices, what we are looking at is an organization wanting to do things in a proper way. That means it is able to carry out some of the functions which are related to employees in a proper and a official or a formal manner. All the activities that the HR department carries out are aligned with the company's mission and vision. So when we talk about these practices, practices could be termed as HR activities in a way. And when we say these activities, these are activities which the HR department carries out when there is a need which arises for a particular, function, or when a particular strategy needs to be employed to manage the workforce effectively. Now, there are lots of HR practices. These practices could be related to compensation, reward, benefits, recruitment, selection, basically these functions of human resources or human, HR functions. But what we are going to be focused on in the learning outcome are practices which are related to coaching in HRM. Why does an organization look at the process of coaching when we look at human resources, or do you look at within the organization? Why do we look at the process of mentoring? And what are the key differences between the two? Training, performance reviews, and appraisals are things that we are aware of, but coaching and mentoring are bits that you need to get into and understand that these are part and parcel of what are called HR practices. Now, HR practices, depending on the type of organization, size of organization, structure of the organization, could be different, because when we talk about these practices tend to be very many. And when we look at some of these practices, when we do talk about the HR, they tend to be traditionally having this meaning. That means the HR department is looking at overall well-being of the employees. They are providing an environment wherein the employees are able to be productive and they thrive in terms of doing their job. They are making sure that the employees are in the right team and the structure so that they are productive and efficient. Compensation and benefits in terms of employees getting against the job that they do are fair and consistent with the policy of the organization. All employees should get relevant training to enhance their skills. And obviously, an organization's structure dictates a lot of things. So if you have an authoritarian structure, or if you have a egalitarian structure or a flat structure in the organization, sometimes the culture of the organization also looks at showing differences. And then how is the information transmitted between or amongst the various employees in the organization would be the various types of HR practices which normally you would see within the organization. Now, this is applicable for junior/middle management. The moment we start talking about senior and middle top management, you would see that these practices might change slightly to coaching, mentoring, and performance reviews and appraisals. So coaching is one such practice, which is basically a form in which an experienced individual, somebody who's been working within the organization for a number of years, would be looking at training and helping the person to step into their role. Now, coaching tends to happen. If I look at an example of football team, you have a football manager and he's a coach. He trains the team because he understands the ins and out of what are the different strengths and weaknesses of different players, and he knows which player plays at what position, and he puts them in the right places to be able to win a match. And that's the role of a manager. That means he's able to manage talent, manage skills, and he's able to manage the expectation of the players, and then put them into allow them to do practice in a particular position so that they are able to play at their best, thereby providing the best performance to the team to be able to win the match. Similarly, when we talk about coaching and the example of coaching in particular, what we are looking at is we are talking about coaching is aiming to produce optimal performance and improvements amongst employees within an organization. Now, it focuses on helping you gain specific skills, which will finally allow you to achieve the goals which have been set by the organization for you and the organizations themselves. And coaching here tends to also be a process wherein sometimes organizations look at asking you to shadow somebody, and in that process, when you're doing the shadowing, they are asking you to follow some of the best practices or adopt some of the best practices which are going to help you improve your performance and your skill sets, thereby allowing you to reach your full potential. Now, coaching can be done in very many different styles. We'll not go into that detail. And there are skills which are required for somebody to be in a position to coach somebody else. And they would be something which obviously at some stage, would be effective, because the person who is doing the coaching is the coach, and the person who is receiving the coaching tends to be the recipient. And in this case, the recipient is able to then understand, or the individual is able to then understand that getting coaching from or having a coaching culture, say, let's put it this way, having a coaching culture within the organization helps to produce improvements at work. And this is why, because most HR departments focus on the aspect of allowing people to gain specific skills from other individuals, and that is why they are asked to basically shadow the other person. Now, when we look at the process of mentoring, it tends to be slightly different, because here the mentor, the person who is doing the mentoring, is called the mentor, and the person who is actually getting the mentoring will be called the mentee or the protege. And in this case, the mentoring process essentially looks at, I would put it this way, if I put this into a bit of context with regards to let's say I want to, so mentoring. So I want to look at giving you an example. So when I look at the process of mentoring, the process of mentoring tends to be looking at, explaining to people when a senior person would be, taking somebody under their wings, a junior employee or a junior person working within the organization, and using a relationship, formal or informal relationship, would actually advise the person on the best ways to carry out a particular job. So in this case, what is happening is that the relationship between the mentor and the mentee is allowing the mentee to pick up knowledge, skills and guidance informally from the mentor to be able to work in different contexts. And in such cases, what you would look at is the process of mentoring actually works. Now, I'll give you an example here. When I talk about, so for example, when I talk about the example of coaching. So coaching in HR will be when, say, for example, just to give an example here, if we see that a number of employees are working on a project, and we see that one of the employees is actually falling back on his schedule because of, say, time management skills. So in this case, what will happen is the coach, the project manager or the team leader would essentially be looking at providing one-on-one training or one-on-one inputs to the employee to say, this is how you need to manage your time, and this is how you need to look at managing your operations. And this will, if you keep this particular as a skill as a example in your mind, then you would be able to better manage and complete the tasks given on time. So when we talk about an example of formal coaching or coaching, essentially coaching would be when a person essentially looks at providing one-on-one training as per the company policy to an employee, where they are able to help the employee adapt to innovations or adapt to and gain certain skills. And that would be an example of coaching. Example of mentoring would be, if I look at somebody senior enough in the organization is leaving, and what will happen is that the senior person who's moving to a higher position, like the CEO of the company, is becoming a chairman. What he will do is basically mentor the newcomer who's going to step into his role as a CEO, and he would be carefully working with him to coach him, basically to mentor him, to look at understanding the ways in which he could become successful and then step into his role, so that he then gets elevated to the chairman's role. So when we talk about example of mentoring, we see this in the leadership development program put together in many companies, wherein they want experienced leaders within the organization to act as mentors for junior employees or individuals who are seeking to enhance their leadership skills. And that would be the essential difference between, when we talk about coaching and mentoring. Now, just out of curiosity, I've also put together, some bits here in terms of a small, table, which basically highlights the differences between the two aspects of, coaching and mentoring. And this is for you to read, because coaching tends to be task-oriented, mentoring tends to focus on progress and continuous improvement or progress which is required to be made by the employee. Coaching tends to be short-term, mentoring tends to be long-term. Coaching looks at, obviously, helping to develop certain immediate short-term skills, and mentoring tends to help in development of capabilities which is required to carry out a particular role. And coaching is driven by you, mentoring is driven by the mentor and the mentee. And obviously, when you look at the two aspects of coaching and mentoring, depending on the size and scale of the organization, the position and the title that you work with, or the job description that you have, you would be put into this process by your organization or by the HR. And depending on the role and the experience of let's put it this way, the role that you're expected to take, and in some cases the experience required in taking up that role, might need you to mirror somebody, shadow somebody, or work with somebody very closely for a number of weeks, months, to be able to step into that position. And that is where you look at the process of coaching and mentoring. Now, any questions on this so far? Right. If there are no questions, we'll get into some of the assessment criteria related to this particular learning outcome. The first assessment criteria talks about explain how HR departments can provide support to people within the workplace. So when we look at this particular aspect, what we are looking at is that when we need to talk about the HR department's support role within a workplace, we need to talk about some of the, competency-based frameworks, which we need to know that how the HR looks at, providing this support to individuals which are basically working within a company. So, for example, this could be support which is required in terms of resources, in terms of teamwork, in terms of understanding understanding the role, maybe some training and development, and they can be studied when we look at certain types of HR frameworks. So when we talk about support, if you think of and put on your creative hat right now and you think of, what kind of support an HR department can provide within the organization. So for this, you need to look at first understanding what could be the problems that you could face wherein you would need to go to the HR department. One of the problems could be there is a conflict which arises between you and some of the other employees, or you and one of the other employee. So in terms of resolution for this conflict, you would need to approach the HR. You might want to take leave, or you might want to, you're not happy within your role, and what you would want to do is have a discussion with your HR manager to say that I'm not happy with my current role, or these are the reasons why I'm not happy and what can be done. So in those cases, you would go back to the HR department and seek their support. If you also, in some cases, see that practically when people work within the organization, sometimes they get excellent job offers from outside. What they would then want to do is discuss with the HR manager internally, saying that I'm getting an offer on salary and a position from a competitor, and I would like to move. Is there something which the organization can do to retain me within the company? And in these kind of situations where you would see, you would generally have this discussion with your HR department, and that is where you would need support. Now, you could also need support from HR because you're not feeling motivated enough in the organization, or not feeling motivated enough to do your role, because you feel that the workload is too much and the compensation or the salary that I get is too less. So in those cases, you would be looking at primarily going back to the HR to say, I need to have a discussion to see what can be done about my job responsibility or my compensation. So these are some of the aspects that you would look at when you talk about, essentially asking and understanding how would the HR department, support people. Now, since we have looked at discussing some of the problems, let's look at the practical examples of how and where we need this support from HR. Now, one of the first things that we look at is two theories that we want to look at before we go into the practical support strategies. One of the theories that we look at is the psychological contract theory. Now, this theory emphasizes that expectation and obligations between employee and employers are always there. Employees expect to be paid on time. Employers expect that the job that they've given, or the person's job description and the responsibility which has been given, the employee will be able to fulfill. When these expectations are met, it leads to increased job satisfaction and commitment from both ends. Sorry. And this tends to be the psychological contract between the employer and the employee. Now, if we feel that the employee is not being able to come up to the expectation of the employer's, let's say expectation of the employer, that means they are falling short in terms of achieving targets, not meeting the expectation or the criteria, then in that case, this psychological contract theory, this contract actually shifts. Employees become demotivated. The employer is already looking at the option of, making the employee redundant or doing a performance review to look at understanding the reasons why the performance is not there from the employee. So in those cases, when we look at the breaking of this particular contract, the psychological contract, HR department comes in and fixes this particular psychological contract. That means they need to balance the expectation of the employee and the expectation of the employer. They look at compensation, benefits, job description, job design, responsibilities given, and the pressure and the workload on the employee to be able to commit and then, commit and complete this particular job. So this is one such reason why you would see that HR support would be required when you're working. And when this employer-employee contract, psychological contract, or this expectation mismatch happens, then in those cases, you would generally see that HR support would be required. Now, the other thing that we look at is sometimes the requirements of the employees tend to differ because they are in different stages of their life. So when we look at, understanding the Maslow's theory of hierarchy, he classified needs of individuals on 5 different types. Sometimes when you start off fresh, you're a fresher, you're fresh out of the college, you're starting off fresh. Most of your needs are physiological needs. That means you need a job which will provide food, water, shelter, and clothing, and some of the other basic functions. Now, as you grow in your career, as you have a number of years of experience, what will happen is your needs and wants and preferences will change. Assuming you are very successful, you have 10 years of experience, you have been, working successfully in achieving targets, your goals would be to maybe try and achieve bigger salary package, or in some cases get promoted or get a more reputed or recognized role within the organization. So in those cases, HR department needs to look at identifying where you are in your journey, and then they should be able to map your wages, your compensation, your role, your responsibilities, your title in such a way that you are motivated enough to be staying with the organization. You are loyal to the organization. You would like to continue within the organization. And that is what the Maslow's theory of hierarchy would essentially help in identifying, that the HR would essentially look at what the employee wants, what is the level of experience and maturity which the employee has, and what could be the demands that the employee might have, and accordingly pitching and meeting those demands would help the HR department keep and retain the employee within the organization. Now, when we talk about practical support strategies where you would need HR support within the organization, would be sometimes we talk about training and development, we look at conflict resolution, mediation, we look at flexible work arrangements, we look at wellness initiatives. These are practical support strategies that HR will provide support on to all employees within the organization. We look at the example of COVID. COVID led to a lot of lockdowns, social distancing, and isolation, and that is where companies had to adopt flexible work arrangements. They had to allow employees to work from home, and this has now become a part and parcel of the employee contract. So sometimes employees are allowed to work from home. Microsoft, for example, in some places across the world has adopted a 4-day working week, and they generally feel that this experimentation that they've done has made their employees more productive in that part of the world, and this allows for flexible work arrangements. We look at wellness initiative. One of the things which we talk about as HR managers is a work-life balance. That means you have a balance between your personal and professional life. And in such cases, the working time directive, or the number of hours that you work within a week or within a month, and how does it help promote your mental health and fitness, essentially is something which HR looks at. So HR looks at providing, for example, in some cases, gym membership, annual dental insurance, looking at wellness programs, stress management workshops. Excuse me. And these are ways in which you would generally see HR would essentially help provide support to you at your workplace. And meeting these requirements from an HR perspective helps the HR retain employees within the organization, help develop a sense of loyalty within the employees towards the organization, and at the same time create job satisfaction amongst the employees within the organization. And that is what would be required to be covered in this first assessment criteria, which is explain how HR department can provide support to people within workplace. Any questions on this, please? The second assessment criteria that we look at is assess policies and procedures designed to support people in the workplace. Now, in this particular assessment criteria, we are looking at assessing. That means we need to take up some policies and procedures and see how they can support people working within an organization or a business. Now, one of the things that we want to look at theoretically would be to understand, the high performance work systems model. Now, this particular model, HPWS, is based on an idea that HR practices, policies, and procedures can enhance both individual as well as organizational performance. Now, this particular model has several components, and the components of this particular model, I think I put that in a particular slide. What I'll do is bring this up here as well. So this particular model that we talk about, HPWS, essentially helps us, understand what are the employees' skill, what are the employees' involvement in day-to-day work within the organization, what are the rewards which the employees can get, and how much can can the employee actually expect job security, or what is the job security aspect related to the function which the employee carries out within the organization. So this particular model that we generally talk about, high performance work system, is an important framework which basically is required by HR professionals to understand and obviously then put into action, because it helps to align the organization and its environment with the structure, system, and processes which the employees tend to follow when they carry out their day-to-day responsibility. Now, if there is a link between employees' ability, their motivation, and the opportunity the organization provides, what we generally get to see is that that organization has or is able to achieve high operational effectiveness. It also is able to be an innovative place to work, and the results which employees actually achieve are quality results, which basically help the organization move forward. Now, when we talk about this particular model in detail, the four components that are a part and parcel of this framework actually include, employee involvement, skill development, performance-based, rewards, and job security. Now, when we talk about these four individual components, what we are looking at is essentially the employee adhering to the policies and procedures and using them effectively while making decision-making to carry out their job responsibilities. So in this case, for example, regular team meetings and suggestion boxes can become effective tools to involve employees in this process. You would generally see that there's a feedback or a suggestion box in most organizations. Now, HR likes to collect suggestions and improvement suggestions or ideas which could be put into practice. One such idea could be that if the organization is looking at reducing its electricity, gas bills, what it could do is it could advise all employees. Somebody could put a suggestion in the boxes: how do we reduce the monthly bill on electricity and gas? One of the suggestions one of the employees puts is that when we leave at the end of the day, we should shut down our PCs rather than putting it on standby, and ensure that any unused IT equipment is not powered on. And that, as a suggestion, if HR takes it, can be a good suggestion, because that would, over a point in time, help in the reduction of electricity bills for the organization. Now, when we look at skills development, here there are policies that HR puts in place which allows employees to continuously better their skills. So in most organizations, you would see there is a career professional development plan or a CPD plan put in place for all employees. And this ensures that all employees undergo training in order to basically keep their skills sharpened, and also to, let's say, get or learn new skills, which will obviously help them perform better in their roles. Performance-based reward tends to be a technique which is a part of this framework, because what HR needs to do is differentiate people from high-performing people from average and good-performing people. If you're performing and overperforming or exceeding the expectation which has been set in your job role, then you should be in line to be recognized by the company and also receive high level of reward. Sometimes these are created as a differentiation strategy, because what the organization wants to do is keep everyone motivated at different levels. And these could be by providing bonuses, by promotions, or other incentives which are required to keep employees within the organization. And then the last, important part of this framework is job security. You would generally see that employees need to feel secure in this job, because if they are performing optimally. Policies which are related to job security should be looking at, making sure that employees should feel safe, that they are not going to be made redundant, or they're not going to be sudden terminations. And this is something which the company offers by giving them long-term contracts or permanent job offer or contracts, and that provides the job security to the individual. So when we talk about, this particular aspect of how policies and procedures are designed to support people in the workplace, this particular model or framework, which is the high performance workplace model, essentially comes into play. And this is something which, most HR managers know, and they keep in mind, is that by building profits, they are looking at people, they're trying to create an organization which is going to be people's first, which are going to have high quality employees, which are going to be people who are basically, competent, and they have the skills. And if you find the right employees, then the goals and targets can be automatically achieved, and the organization tends to perform better. So a high performance work system essentially ensures that the organization is able to provide and align its system structures and processes in such a way that the teams or people working within teams are able to achieve the highest operational effectiveness, thereby producing high quality results for the organization. Any questions at this stage on assessment criteria 4.2? The last one that we want to look at in this particular criteria is assess practices used to support people in workplace. Now, this brings us back to the high performance work system model, because here the HR department tries to create, let's say, a conduit or a balance between having the right ability or the right organizational structure with the right systems, policies, and processes, along with teams or people in place to be able to deliver the organizational goals. And when we look at this particular bit, what we are looking at understanding is that how do we ensure that the HR department actually has these things in place to be able to deal with employees, and also ensure that the practices are fair and consistent and in line with the requirements of legislation. So when we talk about these in particular, we talk about things like performance appraisal. That means at the end of the year, all employees should be appraised in terms of their work, and if their appraisal is meeting the predefined criteria, then they should be given bonuses or rewards or incentives or increments which are as promised in their employment contract. If we do feel that they're not meeting the criteria, then in those cases the employee should be put into training and development that would allow them to improve theirs or hone their skills, and that would mean that they would be performing better in the subsequent years. Now, when we look at examples to understand this particular learning outcome assessment practices. So when we talk about the assessment practices, what we are looking at here is talking in details about, how would HR support people in workplace through a systematic process or an approach. And that would mean, for example, they would want to include employees and get them engaged in all parts of the business processes. An example that I would give here is that how would you assess practices used by HR can support people in workplace? For example, if the organization decides that they have to move the office, the city offices are very expensive, and the organization does a survey with with its employees to find out if they move from the city of London, if they move the office to the outskirts, will it be conducive and beneficial for the employees to travel and come to the new offices. Now, if the survey comes out and employees agree that yes, it will reduce time required to travel during congestion, or time required to commute to the office, some of the employees might object that no, this will become far away from my place and it would mean I would need to travel more, or I would need to spend more time in traveling. Some employees would come up with the objection that would it allow flexible working or working from home in certain criteria or certain days. And these are the kind of the feedback which the HR would receive when they carry out this survey. Now, if the survey predicts that yes, obviously the company is able to save a lot of cost, but the employees are also willing to move with the or undertake this change and move and adjust to this particular move of the office relocation, then in this case the HR has done a couple of things. It has won a battle wherein obviously it has got all the employees involved. They have basically taken mindshare from the employees to be able to be mentally ready for this move. Second, they have taken and looked at some of the objections which the employees have placed, and that has given them enough ideas to understand what could be the objections the employees would face, whether some employees would end up leaving because it's going to be far away from their place. If flexibility or working from home is not allowed, they would help the HR calculate what could be the percentage of employees leaving the organization if this move is to go ahead. So it will help them do some contingency planning. It will basically look at mitigating some risks, and it will also help in reviewing regularly the progress in terms of how the office relocation or the relocation move is actually happening. This would also show the HR as a supportive culture, because it is doing something which is primarily taking the employee's perspective into account, and then ensuring that they are not only following through on what employees have raised as concerns, but also looking at mitigating some of those concerns, and that would be useful for people for HR, as it could be seen as they are supporting people in the workplace. So when we talk about these kind of points, for example, I've taken a couple of them on the slide, but if you would be you would need to take maybe just one or two of them, and that would be used to explain how people HR practices can support people in their workplace. So when you look at putting, say for example, adequate compensation, benefits, and when I look at some organizations, again depending on size and scale of their working, some organizations have a gym in the office, some organizations have coffee or cafeteria within the office, some organizations primarily provide for some of the rewards like compensation, benefits, but also things like um, memberships and other discount memberships or discount cards which are available to employees within the organization, because they're able to negotiate with other companies depending on the number of employees in the organization, and that allows these benefits or discount benefits to be passed on to the employees in the organization. So these are various ways in which HR can look at actually supporting people within the workplace. Now, that brings us to the end of this particular discussion on Learning Outcome 4, which is to understand the structures designed to support people within a workplace. Now, there are two particular, articles that I would expect you to go ahead and read just to look at a bit more understanding on what we have covered in today's lecture. And both of these are related to, the HR side of things. One is the HR policies CIPD, worksheet. And that worksheet essentially is quite useful simply because it would throw some more light into what are the various benefits, of HR, thinking of, the HR roles, and obviously the, policies and procedures which are aligned in such a way that they are basically friendly for the employees of the organization. And the other is, I'm just going to quickly show this to you. The other is basically a worksheet on organizational design, which basically provides insight into what could be the reasons, fundamental reasons in the way which HR can structure the organization, so that the structure, when we talk about people structure, the organizational structure, it's conducive to employee practices within the organization. So let me just quickly show this to you on my side, and then that will be some additional reading that you could do to understand this learning outcome in a bit more detail. So one of the websites is this, which is talking about HR policies. I would suggest that you go through what are HR policies, how you develop HR policies for additional reading, and what is the difference. It's a good 10-15 minute read, which is this particular page. The other thing which I would also suggest is organizational design, because it is related to the structure that is designed to support people within the organization. So what is organizational design? Why is it that HR needs to consider organizational design? And this is an important one to read. And the third is coaching and mentoring. So this bit in terms of coaching and mentoring, I would suggest that you read, because it will highlight some of the HR practices which highlight some of the practices which HR needs to adopt essentially, and they would be useful for you to understand the concept of when is coaching put into place, and when is mentoring put into place. And these are going to be useful articles for you to read to build a bit more knowledge on today's discussion. One last article which I put together is basically article on the organizational structure and the benefits of each. So there are different types of organizational structures. Sometimes HR plays a role in picking out a particular type of structure because of the nature of the products and services or the type of organization that you work in, and these structures can help in producing a conducive culture within the organization. And this article will also be looking at providing you some idea into why are structures important, especially from an organization point of view, to look at, ensuring that, let's put it this way, employees are loyal within the organization, and as a result, there is, progress which can be made with support from the HR in the organization. So I hope you've enjoyed this particular lecture. We'll meet up tomorrow to discuss Learning Outcome 5, and the lecture is going to be at the same time at 1 p.m. So until then,